Welcome to the program. I'm Jeff Schechtman. There's an ongoing debate in the world of sports as to whether marketing and success is about the team or about the celebrity power of individual star athletes. Years ago, the NFL made the decision it was about the team. The NBA very consciously made the opposite decision, that individual stars were the key to success. Without collusion or even a formal meeting, it certainly appears that Silicon Valley long ago made the decision that companies often rise or fall on individuals or celebrity CEOs and their power to sell, market, and capture the public imagination. Steve Jobs, of course, is the penultimate example. But so is Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and the founder of Uber, Travis Kalanick. The problem is that in the case of Kalanick, that image is tarnished, to say the least. We're going to talk about that today with my guest, Adam Lashinsky. Adam Lashinsky is the executive editor of Fortune. He's editorial director of Fortune Brainstorm Tech Conference. He is the co-chair of the Fortune Global Forum. He's written for numerous publications, including the New York Times. He's appeared on Fox News. He's the best-selling author of Inside Apple. And it is my pleasure to welcome Adam Lashinsky back to this program to talk about Wild Ride, inside Uber's quest for world domination. Adam, thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
A delight to have you here. I want to begin by talking a little bit about the origin story that Uber tells. Talk a little bit about that. Every company, it seems, particularly technology companies, Silicon Valley companies, have their origin story. For Uber, what is it?
Indeed, and I have to tell you, I enjoyed your lead-in very much. It was such an interesting, nuanced way of approaching this topic. Uber's origin story is that Travis Kalanick and his friend Garrett Camp, who had been the founder of an earlier company called StumbleUpon, were attending a conference in Paris in December, and there was a blizzard, and they couldn't get a cab, and they were visiting the Eiffel Tower, and they said, wouldn't it be great if you could just take out your phone and hit a button and a taxi would appear, and the idea for Uber was born. That is, as you asked me, that is the origin myth.
Now, Uber wasn't really the first company to do that. It may have become the leader, but it wasn't the first.
It wasn't the first, and in fact, it wasn't even how the company started. The idea had come a little bit earlier, not on that snowy night, which was a convenient story. But you're right. There was Sidecar and others had the concept, but what they ended up executing shortly after that was vastly superior to what the others had done.
And tell us a little bit about Kalanick, a little bit about his history and background.
So Travis Kalanick, who is 40 today, grew up in Los Angeles, in Northridge to be precise. As he describes it, the very middle of the middle class. Very bright student, good athlete, went to UCLA to study computer engineering and business. Didn't graduate because he fell in with a bunch of other students who were doing an entrepreneurial startup, and that startup ended up dying. But by this point, he was out in the real world, and really spent his 20s and the first part of his 30s trying to do another startup that eventually was a modest success, so that by the time he got involved with Uber in his mid-30s, he was someone who had been involved in this startup scene for quite a long time, but not terribly successful at it.
What had he learned from those experiences and the sort of pugnaciousness that is part of Kalanick? How much was that exhibited in some of these early startups?
Well, he probably because he was the most business-minded of his computer science pals. Early on, the task fell to him to be the fundraiser, so to go to venture capitalists and others to ask for money. And so the pugnaciousness that you refer to, I believe, is one of these bread-and-the-bone things with him, but that's just who he is. But what he learned was this tiresome and tireless process of asking investors for money and being persistent and being rejected and being humiliated. He had done this for years before he comes to the point in his career where he's going out and asking for money for something that appears to be a huge success and people are throwing money at him. That was never his experience before then.
And did it create in him a kind of anger or bitterness that was stronger than what might have been there originally?
Well, it's a good question. I'm not a psychotherapist or analyst, so I can't say. I can observe, with the same TV degree that most of us have, that that he had a chip on his shoulder from that experience. But in the positive sense, he identifies as an entrepreneur. This is there's almost a missionary zeal among these people. They are, bringing light into the world by starting companies. And so I would say that was those two things would define his mentality coming into Uber.
Talk about some of his early battles, particularly in San Francisco, where a lot of the fight began.
Sure. People have asked me, well, why is this company so controversial? And I point out it started in controversy shortly after it began offering this limousine hailing service in San Francisco. And people forget that Uber didn't start with normal cars. It didn't start with taxis. It started with limos. And at the time, it was called Uber Cab, because that's the name that the guy who founded the company, whose name is Garrett Camp, chose. But shortly after it started operating in San Francisco, the city and county of San Francisco caught wind of this, and they said, well, you're violating our taxi regulations, and they appeared at the office of Uber, which was just a small handful of people. Travis Kalanick wasn't even the CEO at the time, with a cease and desist letter. And the company's response, and I encourage people to think everything you know about Uber since then, it's battles all around the world. The company's response on this early day was to do two things. Number one, to ignore the cease and desist letter. They said, we're not a taxi company. This cease and desist letter doesn't apply to us. But now that you mention it, we also aren't a cab company, so we're going to remove the word cab from our name, and that's when they became Uber.
Talk a little bit about how the culture of the company evolved.
The culture of the company is one of these pure reflections of the CEO, very similar to the companies that you mentioned in your introduction. So Travis Kalanick he prizes hustling, he prizes long, hard hours, he prizes, not taking no for an answer. And these are some of the characteristics of the company. As they hit this inflection point in 2013, 14, 15, and they started growing like crazy, they attracted what one person referred to me as growth junkies, people from other big Silicon Valley companies like Google and Facebook and elsewhere who liked being part of these pressure cooker, high growth, high stress environments.
What did Kalanick think of other startups, other companies in Silicon Valley?
Well, he's a champion of them, like many people in his position. So there was a period between his last startup and Uber where he himself was an angel investor. These people who don't have a real job and put relatively small amounts of money into startups because they like to be involved. And so he's, like Steve Jobs, by the way, quite a champion of other entrepreneurs.
And yet he's had fights with so many other entrepreneurs in the Valley.
Well, he's had fights with, I don't think entrepreneurs are in any special class there. He had fights with anybody who has reasons to fight with Uber.
Talk about the growth, the explosiveness of that growth, and how it got beyond even the company's ability to manage it.
Well, what fascinated me about Uber from the time that I started researching it is that this company was able to grow globally extraordinarily quickly in a way that wouldn't have been possible before the iPhone. So because it began its life as an iPhone app, and because the iPhone is everywhere, and because the App Store is everywhere, it was able to start operating in countries, in cities around the United States, and in countries all over the world in its second and third year of operations. So the growth, I wouldn't say it was helter-skelter, but they developed a process of sending launch teams, they call them, out to these cities, and the product caught on like wildfire because initially consumers loved the service.
How similar is the Uber story in terms of its growth and the power of its founder, CEO? How similar is the story to what we've seen, certainly in different forms, in other successful Silicon Valley companies, whether it's, the prime example being Apple and what happened to Steve Jobs as that company grew, or even Google, where a grown-up CEO was brought in at a certain point. And we've seen this over and over again in so many companies. Talk about the way that same idea did and didn't play out with respect to Uber.
Sure, or I would say has or hasn't played out. As we're talking, this is literally headline news and playing out as we speak. If I look for an example of a successful entrepreneur-driven company at this stage of Uber's development, I would look to Amazon and Jeff Bezos more than to some of the other companies you referenced, because like Jeff Bezos, Travis Kalanick actually was an experienced entrepreneur, or in Bezos' case, a mature business person by the time their respective companies started. So I think that's why, at least at this point, which is about 7 years in, Kalanick hasn't been willing to not be CEO in the same way that Bezos wasn't, whereas Zuckerberg and Larry Page and Sergey Brin and Steve Jobs all were very young, and so and even Bill Gates, they were all persuaded that they needed this quote unquote adult supervision around them, and Kalanick hasn't until now been willing to acknowledge that. And in his case, it's really not adult supervision that he needs, but it's something. It's some kind of supervision.
Is it your sense, and this is speculation, but you've looked at this, you've spent time, inside the company, that had that supervision, business supervision, call it what you will, come into the company sooner, if it was there, would the company have grown any differently? Would it be any more or less successful today?
Well, so great question, and that's a parlor game among people who pay very careful attention to Uber, because the general consensus among both fans and critics is that the company never would have gotten to where it got without Kalanick. He was the visionary, ruthless force driving Uber to where it went. And so, you're right, it's speculation and it's revisionist, but that school of thought says that if you had either pulled him out or diminished his power at any step along the way, then you wouldn't see the positive growth that had happened, and the speculation obviously that you might have the negative things might have been ameliorated.
The other part of that, sort of the corollary of that, is whether all of the bad publicity and all of this negative pressure against Kalanick has in some ways made the situation worse, not analogous to what we see in Washington these days.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you how I've been thinking about this. I'm a journalist, and I try very hard not to be a cheerleader for any people or companies that I write about. That said, I'm a human being, so I'm watching it very carefully, and I have noticed that, and maybe for many good reasons, Uber simply doesn't catch a break these days, right? So, I'm telling you, if they, if they hiccup or if they have a burp, so metaphorically, it's going to be noticed and it's going to be criticized. And so I think you're making the right observation, which is that they're on a negative feedback loop right now, and it's very hard to break that. And so and much of it deserved, by the way. So, but it amplifies itself, and it makes it very hard to see anything good.
And how does this relate to what has been perceived as this highly misogynistic culture inside the company? To what extent is that filtered down as deep as it seems?
So I don't know, and we don't have to wait much longer, right? Because former U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder and a team of lawyers has spent several months studying this very topic, and they have access to everybody they want to have access to, and they've made a report to the board of directors of Uber, and Uber has promised or has suggested that some version of that report will make its way out to the public, and we'll find out. That's the sort of, I haven't had the ability to understand that deeply enough to compare it with the rest of the business world where those kinds of things exist. And again, and I'm not suggesting that Uber's just straight down the middle, the same as everyone else, or not. I don't know.
What impact has all of this publicity, bad publicity, and certainly all the attention that's paid to it in this investigation, all of this, what impact has it had on the business side of Uber?
Well, I don't know, and they have data on that, and they haven't shared it. So I get my information on this the same way a lot of people do, which is often by talking to my Uber drivers. And anecdotally, it seems to have an impact at times, and then it abates, and then it depends what kind of customer you're talking about. There are some customers in certain cities like San Francisco and New York and other places who will not associate themselves with Uber anymore. There's another class of customer, I've talked to many people like this, and the drivers tell me they have too, who want the car that's going to be least expensive and that's going to show up most quickly. Until now, that's been Uber because of their scale. So, we really don't have any hard data. Their business continues to grow, but even that isn't a reliable figure because they raised so much money that they have the ability to subsidize rides wherever they want, which tends to make the business grow.
Talk a little bit about the drivers. You spend a lot of time talking about them and have spent a lot of time talking to them.
Well, and I spent a small amount of time being one.
Right?
I did this for the book, and again, it's complicated and it's complex. When Uber first burst onto the scene and Uber X became a big deal, this is ordinary people driving ordinary cars. Drivers were very excited. They were being well paid. They could make a lot of cash quickly. Over time, Uber lowered prices because that's something they want to do to make the service attractive, and they lowered the commission that they paid to drivers. And more drivers came onto the streets, which has the obvious dampening effect of available fares for the drivers. So now, to summarize, what you'll hear from drivers is that Uber doesn't care about them. Uber treats them like numbers. It's harder and harder for us to make a living. And by the way, that was my conclusion, that it's a tough way to make a living. And then on the other hand, even the fiercest critics, you say, well, why are you still driving? They'll say, well, I don't have any other ways to make quick money right now, and I love the flexibility. That's always been one of Uber's big selling points from a driver perspective, is that you go out and drive when you want to. So I've spoken to a bunch of people who say, I get to have bedtime with my kids, and then I go out and drive, and what other job would let me do that?
How do they view the competition? How do they view Lyft and any other competition?
So, well, let's start with Lyft. They view Lyft, I think, they will tell you they're confident that they're going to beat Lyft because they're bigger, Uber is bigger, Uber has more money. The flaw in that argument is that Lyft has access to plenty of money. They've raised a lot of venture capital, and then most recently they raised money from the private equity firm KKR, and Lyft is giving them a run for the money. Other competitors are giving them a run for the money around the world, and in one very notable case in China, Didi knocked Uber out of the market completely.
Many of these issues that we've been talking about with respect to Uber and its culture and some of these other areas, is there a universality to that? I mean, they exist in 500-some cities now throughout the world. Is there consistency to some of these things, or is what we're talking about pretty much confined to the U.S.?
It's not confined to the U.S. They're sort of their aggressive nature. They're take no or don't ask for permission. Culture exists everywhere in the world, but they've taken different approaches in different places, and they've taken different approaches over time. So, for example, in the U.S., they started with this mentality of just starting operations and then talking to regulators later. They've stopped doing that. They've been engaged in an extensive and sophisticated conversation with regulators over the last few years.
Talk a little bit about their surge pricing, which has come in for such criticism.
Sure. So surge pricing in other industries is known as dynamic pricing. You charge more when there's more demand. In Uber's case, to stimulate more supply. In other words, to get more drivers driving because they can make more money, and also to discourage certain people from requesting a ride because they don't want to pay that much. And that this mechanism is a classic economic mechanism that brings supply and demand and price into equilibrium. And that's certainly how Travis Kalanick views it. He has made comments to the extent that he has a hard time understanding why people don't understand that, because it makes such logical sense. And it does, but of course there are the outliers where what looks like rational dynamic pricing to him looks like price gouging to others. And that's where they've gotten into. That's what has angered people so much.
What is Kalanick's vision for the company now?
Well, he has very grand visions for the company, and he thinks of it as a transportation and logistics network and marketplace. So the grand vision is that they're moving people around now, but they should be able to, but they also deliver food now, and they, in theory, should be able to move anything, and they should be able to move it with whatever vehicle the times call for. So now it's cars driven by average people. Two visions of the future that they have is that in the future that it will be robotic cars and maybe even flying cars.
How does he view the potential of autonomous cars at this point?
I think his thinking on autonomous cars is not particularly radical. Most of the technology and automotive world believe now that autonomous vehicles will be a fact because the technology and the logic behind them are so powerful. People forget, isn't this awful? We're going to be driven by robots. Well, the data is fairly clear that robots will be a hell of a lot safer than humans who get drunk and distracted and tired and so on. But so it's not so much a question of if, but when. And I don't think his views are any different from the leadership at General Motors, Google, Tesla, and so on.
And finally, do you think Kalanick survives all of this publicity these days, or that someone else will be brought in, or that he will bring someone else in for that adult business supervision?
Yeah, well, in fact, they publicly said that they're looking for a chief operating officer in Silicon Valley. That's the shorthand for that is that he's looking for his Sheryl Sandberg, who has played that role, so well for Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook. And I don't think it's any exaggeration to say that this is the most critical hire that the company will make. That this person will make or break whether or not Kalanick himself can be an effective leader internally and externally. And I should say particularly externally.
Of course, the other side of that is that the person with the confidence and the security to take that job working with somebody like Kalanick is also somebody that potentially will clash with him. That's exactly right. That's what makes this such a high wire act. The person who they need undoubtedly craves a CEO role of their own and needs to be somebody who's capable of being CEO, which isn't on offer right now. So it's not impossible. It's a big challenge. It's a high-profile challenge. It could be, if it works well, it's a lucrative challenge. So there are obstacles to finding this person, but there are benefits as well. Adam Lashinsky, his book is Wild Ride, Inside Uber's Quest for World Domination. Adam, I thank you so much for spending some time with us today.
I thank you so much.
Thank you.